Alright guys, we are going to be reacting to Zhukov's top 3 legendary tactical move. No AI. Let's see what's going on, guys. Let's jump in.
In den frühen Morgenstunden des historischen 22. Juni, auf einer Frontbreite von 2400 Kilometern, vollzieht sich der größte Aufmarsch, den die Geschichte bisher gesehen hat.
When Germany invaded the Soviet Union in 1941, the German High Command viewed the Soviet generals as incompetent, especially after the recent military purges by Stalin. But as the war dragged on, one commander in particular began to distinguish himself, a man that the German High Command would soon come to both fear and greatly respect. Georgy Zhukov was one of the greatest military tacticians Russia has ever produced. By introducing new military doctrines, he crushed the Japanese spearheads in the east, broke the German blitzkrieg at Moscow, and ensured that the Soviet Union would not only survive her darkest hour, but to go on to become a leading superpower in the world. But what set him apart from everyone else? In this mini-documentary, we will look closer into Zhukov's most legendary tactical maneuvers on the battlefield that solidified him as arguably the single greatest commander of the Second World War. In 1939, just before the outbreak of World War II in the West, border clashes between the Soviets and the Japanese were escalating in the East, especially between the Japanese puppet state of Manchukuo and the Stalin-allied communist state of Mongolia. The Japanese believed that the border between Manchukuo and Mongolia was the Khalkhin River, but Mongolia and the Soviet Union maintained that the border actually runs some 16 kilometers east of the river, which created tension between the border patrols. And by the summer of 1939, the border between Mongolia and Manchukuo had become a boiling point of escalating skirmishes, and both sides began building up their forces in the area. On the 1st of June, Zhukov was summoned to Moscow, where he feared he would be arrested by the NKVD and become yet another victim of Stalin's military purges. But to his relief, he was instead given the control of the 1st Army Group in Khalkhin Gol with the objective of putting down the constant Japanese aggression. Zhukov arrived 4 days later on the 5th of June, and upon scouting the vast, flat and treeless terrain, he quickly figured out what was needed to destroy the Japanese threat. He brought in motorized brigades, aircraft, as well as fast-moving BT tanks which he believed would be well suited for such an empty and flat terrain. Zhukov believed that in an environment like this, tanks shouldn't simply support infantry, but operate as independent strike groups that can move fast and hit hard without being slowed down by foot soldiers, which was a sharp break from conventional Soviet doctrine, and one that the Japanese were utterly unprepared for. After several skirmishes and smaller battles, the front had finally frozen into a stalemate by the late of July, but Zhukov had no intention of having it remain that way, and prepared for a full attack on the 20th of August. In the days leading up to the battle, Zhukov used the cover of darkness to gradually move his units into attack positions, as well as having the mufflers of his supply trucks removed and have them drive in front of the tanks during the night to geniusly conceal the sound of the tank engines. And every night prior to the attack, the Soviet side of the steppe thundered with engine noise, with Japanese patrols struggling to not only understand how large the Soviet buildup had become, but also to understand what the Soviet buildup even consisted of. But then, in the morning of the 20th of August 1939, the Mongolian steppe erupted with the sound of shattering artillery fire, followed soon after by over 550 aircraft that pulverized the Japanese front line. The Japanese struggled to realize what was happening because this was actually the very first fighter-bomber offensive in Soviet Air Force history. But shortly after the bombardment, over 50,000 Soviet and Mongolian troops stormed the Japanese center. The Japanese now braced for a direct fight and ferried in units from the flanks to sustain the massive assault on the center. But that was exactly what Zhukov was waiting for, because as the Japanese forces were now pinned down in the center, two powerful armored wings, namely the 4th, the 6th and the 11th tank brigades, swept in wide around both of the Japanese flanks, driving deep behind enemy lines.
Wow.
Supply roads, communication lines and escape routes were overrun at lightning speed, and by the 25th of August, the two Soviet wings linked up near Nomonhan.
Wow.
The Japanese 23rd Division, the elite corps of the Japanese 6th Army in the
That's
region,
it.
was completely surrounded on the open steppe with nowhere to run. The Japanese had not only misjudged Zhukov's logistical ability to build up his forces so far away from his supply base, but had also been completely deceived about the true location of his armored units. A desperate attempt to break out was completely destroyed by Soviet fortifications, and the now surrounded Japanese forces who refused to surrender was pulverized by Soviet aircraft and artillery into complete annihilation.
Wow.
Zhukov had achieved exactly what he intended, a perfect encirclement and the total destruction of an entire Japanese division. Japan would never again risk a
Wow, that is crazy, man. They have no mercy. They just deleted them.
war with the Soviet Union, and would from now on turn its ambitions towards the Pacific instead. Zhukov's innovative use of armored spearheads, in addition to his extraordinary ability to handle logistics and move incredible amounts of armored units effectively, earned him special attention from the Soviet High Command, a recognition that would soon place him in the center of the greatest war in human history.
I mean, it is what it is. Damn, man.
By the autumn of 1941, the Soviet Union was on the brink of collapse. In just 4 months, Operation Barbarossa had eaten through thousands of kilometers of vital Soviet territory, destroyed entire Soviet armies, and left millions dead or captured. The Germans now turned their sight on Moscow, and on the 2nd of October 1941, the Wehrmacht launched Operation Typhoon, which was an offensive towards the capital, consisting of nearly 1 million men and 1,700 tanks. The German spearheads quickly smashed through the Bryansk and Vyazma defenses, resulting in the encirclement of over 500,000 Soviet troops, one of the worst Soviet disasters of the war, leaving Moscow virtually defenseless. German propaganda was now claiming that a Soviet collapse was imminent and that German soldiers would return home by Christmas. On the 10th of October, Zhukov was urgently flown in from the Leningrad defense and given one task: to hold Moscow at all costs. At this point, the situation was critical, but Zhukov acted immediately, and one of his first orders was to hastily convert Moscow's factories to produce armaments. Clock factories were put to produce mines, chocolate factories to make canned food, and the automobile factories were converted into tank repair shops. Even the women and the teenagers were put into building anti-tank ditches, moving almost 3 million cubic meters of earth with no mechanical help. He also stapled together new Soviet divisions from scratch and ordered all available forces to strengthen the Mosaic line. And even though the Soviets continued to lose ground throughout October, the mounting German casualties from the new Soviet defenses forced them to slow down the offensive from the 31st of October, which gave Zhukov some time to reorganize his forces before the winter. And after having learned through espionage that Japan would not attack the USSR in the east, the Siberian and Far Eastern divisions were quickly called in to reinforce the Moscow defenses. And these men were battle-hardened and accustomed to fighting in temperatures that froze the German panzer engines solid. Zhukov placed them at critical sectors along the front and prepared for the German attack that was certain to come. And on the 15th of November, the Wehrmacht launched the attack they hoped would knock the USSR out of the war. It was a pincer attack meant to encircle Moscow and link up near the city of Noginsk. The northern German tank armies made a successful offensive towards Klin, but in the south, the German pincer was violently stopped by fresh Soviet reinforcements. Zhukov recalls in his memoirs, "The enemy, ignoring the casualties, was making frontal assaults, willing to get to Moscow by any means necessary." And considering that the Germans had a severe lack of winter clothing and reported over 100,000 cases of frostbites, this paints a picture of just how desperate the Germans were to find shelter in Moscow before the full onslaught of the Russian winter set in. The German general Fedor von Bock even stated in a report to Berlin that on the 30th of November, the temperature was minus 45 degrees Celsius. But despite the Germans' efforts, Zhukov's brilliant setup of the multi-layered defense in all the correct spots reduced the Soviet losses while inflicting tremendous casualties on the advancing Germans. Still, the Wehrmacht pressed on. But as the southern pincer was slowly approaching the city of Kashira, Zhukov organized a vicious counterattack, which included a brand new force equipped with the new semi-automatic SVT-40 rifles, as well as factory new KV-1s and T-34
That
tanks.
helps a lot.
The fighting was vicious, but the armored spearhead of Guderian was for the first time in the war pushed back over 40 kilometers to the town of Mordves. The German pincer was finally halted. And after this brilliant defensive operation, Zhukov launched the first major Soviet counteroffensive of the war on the 5th of December. Over 1 million Soviet troops and over 1,700 tanks surged forward along a 1,000-kilometer front.
Damn, bro. Imagine having that war like this, man. With the amount of coldness that you have to go through. Oh my God.
Sweeping around the German flanks. And by early January, the Wehrmacht had been forced up to 250 kilometers away from Moscow. The capital was saved, and the German dream of capturing Moscow and ending the war by Christmas was over. Zhukov had once again proved his mastery of logistics, defensive layering, and the rare ability to read the enemy's intentions. Zhukov was now celebrated as a hero in the Soviet Union, but the German war machine was far from defeated. After failing to take Moscow, the Wehrmacht turned its aim on the oil fields of the Caucasus, the lifeblood of the German war machine. The city that guarded the Volga River and anchored the northern flank of this push was Stalingrad. Zhukov noted the importance of the city, saying that, "It was clear to me that the battle for Stalingrad was of the greatest military and political significance. If Stalingrad fell, the enemy command would be able to cut off the south of the country from the center." In August, the Luftwaffe started dropping up to 1,000 tons of bombs on the city every single day, turning it into smoldering ruins. The German mechanized infantry divisions then advanced through the city, taking 90% of it by September. But the remaining 10% were the industrial districts, which were difficult for the German tanks to navigate in after all the bombing, meaning that it all needed to be taken by infantry. And as the fight for these industrial buildings intensified, the situation became a horror show for both sides. And Stalin's infamous order, "not one step back," resulted in virtually every building becoming a battleground.
Wow.
German commanders described the fighting in the factories as combat inside of a furnace, where snipers and grenades took thousands of lives every single day. One letter found on the body of a dead German officer described the utter carnage. "We are fighting like madmen but cannot reach the river. The whole war for France was shorter than the fight for one Volga factory. They have simply decided to fight to the last soldier. And how many soldiers are left over there? When will this hell come to an end?"
Damn.
But what they didn't know is that Zhukov kept supplying only just enough men and equipment into Stalingrad to keep the Germans tunnel vision on the city, which left them blind to the real threat that was developing outside of the city. Zhukov was preparing a plan to not just defend Stalingrad, but drawing upon his experience from the Battle of Khalkhin Gol in 1939, he also aimed to completely destroy the German force inside of the city. He understood that the German 6th Army under General Paulus was severely overextended, with virtually the entire German army sent deep into Stalingrad, which meant that the flanks were not held by elite German units, but by poorly equipped Romanians with virtually zero anti-tank weaponry, which could only spell disaster when confronting the armored spearhead of Zhukov out in a vast open steppe. And again, just like the Japanese in Khalkhin Gol, the Germans had severely underestimated Zhukov's ability to utilize the military doctrine of Maskirovka, meaning to move and build up incredible amounts of armored units over the span of months, all while keeping...
and because they did have the resources to do so. And people don't understand this. People see the war that is going on in Ukraine right now, and they think that Russia somehow is going to stop doing what they're doing. Like, not understanding the history about the country in itself, Russia's going to keep moving forward regardless of how many casualties they take. Since they already have the manpower, they have the resources to keep this war going.
Keeping them covered from the prying eyes of the Luftwaffe reconnaissance. And by mid-November, Zhukov had quietly assembled 5 complete Soviet armies. the 1st Guards Army, the 5th Tank Army, and the 21st Soviet Army in the north, and the 51st and 57th Soviet armies in the south, and proceeded to launch the attack on the 19th of November. Zhukov's northern and southern spearheads raced forward, and the effect was immediate and devastating. Within hours, Soviet armor smashed through the poorly equipped defenders, and the enormous gaps in the Axis defensive lines were opening up everywhere. And before the German commanders inside of Stalingrad could even comprehend what was happening, their flanks had already vanished. On the 23rd of November, just 4 days after the offensive began, the two Soviet encircling forces met at the town of Khalkhin, completing one of the most famous encirclements in military history. The entire German 6th Army, over 250,000 of Germany's best men, along with thousands of vehicles, guns and equipment, was trapped inside of a shrinking pocket in Stalingrad. And throughout December, Soviet artillery pulverized the pocket from all sides. The 6th Army continued to be grinded down until the last survivors finally surrendered on the 2nd of February.
Wow.
And yet again, Zhukov had executed both the planning and the operation itself without error, delivering the most crushing German defeat up to that point, and the Wehrmacht would be forced on the defensive for the rest of the war.
There we have it. Damn, very good history about Russians really pushing. I didn't know Romania was a German ally. I did not know that. I didn't know there was their ally. I thought that was more Romanian was more into the Russian side of things. But you never know. This is why you learn history. And it seemed like Romania was a huge influence in the Battle of Stalingrad. Wow. Let me know what you guys think, guys. I would love to hear you guys' opinions. I will see you next one.